In the vast silence of the frontier, a person's true measure is not found in peace, but in the choices they make when the storm is at their door. Montana Territory, 1882. The winter held the foothills of the Crazy Mountains in a merciless grip, a world silenced by snow. For Abigail Holt, the solitude of the remote ranch was both a balm and a burden. It was the place her husband, Dr. Arthur Holt, had built for them, a sanctuary that had become her quiet prison after his passing. The wind howled a mournful tune around the log cabin, a constant reminder of her isolation. She stoked the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Each gust of wind felt like a clawing hand, trying to pull her out into the unforgiving white expanse that stretched for miles in every direction. The silence was deep, broken only by the crackle of pine logs. A sudden thud against the heavy oak door startled her, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm. She froze, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. It came again, weaker this time, a desperate scraping. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. No sane person would be out in this blizzard. But Arthur's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady, a lesson he had taught her many times. Every soul is worth saving, Abigail. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open, bracing against the furious onslaught of wind and snow that blinded her for a moment. A dark shape lay collapsed on her doorstep. It was a man, a Cheyenne warrior by his buckskin attire and long, dark hair matted with ice. He was unconscious, teetering on the precipice between life and death. For a heart-stopping second, her instinct screamed at her to shut the door, to pretend she had seen nothing. This was a land of fragile treaties and simmering hatred. A lone white woman and an Indian warrior was a combination that could only lead to disaster. But looking at the man's still form, she saw not a threat, but a human being in desperate need. Ignoring the cold that bit at her skin, she began the Herculean task of dragging him inside, away from the blizzard's fatal embrace. With a final heave, she pulled him fully inside and slammed the door, shutting out the storm's fury. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. He was heavy, a dead weight of frozen muscle and wet hide. She managed to get him onto the bare rug before the hearth, her own breath coming in ragged gasps. Kneeling beside him, she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter, a fragile butterfly wing against the grip of death. She knew in that moment that her act of compassion was a point of no return. She had invited the unknown into her home, and the consequences, whatever they were, would be hers to bear. Her first priority was warmth. The warrior's skin was like ice to the touch, a chilling cold that seemed to radiate from him. She worked frantically, adding more logs to the fire until it roared to life, its heat a welcome wave against the room's chill. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. She looked at his still form, the harsh lines of the frontier blurring for a moment. This was not about race or conflict. This was about survival, a battle against the elements that made equals of all men. Arthur would have done the same without a second thought. She had to honor his memory. She had to try. Carefully, she began the difficult and intimate task of removing his frozen clothing. The buckskin tunic and leggings were stiff with ice, the leather thongs nearly impossible to undo. She had to use Arthur's small surgical knife to cut some of them, her movements practical and swift. Beneath the layers, his skin was shockingly cold. She saw the intricate beadwork on his clothes, patterns of eagles and bison, telling a story of a life and a people she did not understand. It was a testament to his standing, a sign that he would be missed, and that people would come looking for him. The thought sent a fresh shiver of fear down her spine. Once he was undressed, she covered him with every blanket she owned, piling them high. She heated water over the fire and, using soft rags, began to gently chafe his hands and feet, trying to coax life back into his frozen limbs. The firelight played across his features, revealing a face of sharp, noble lines. He was young, perhaps no more than 25 winters, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. Old scars, thin white lines against his skin, spoke of past battles and a life of hardship. In his stillness, he looked less like a warrior and more like a vulnerable young man, lost and far from home. A strange, protective feeling stirred within her. As she worked, a quiet rhythm established itself in the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the warrior's faint, labored breaths. Abigail felt a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that had been absent since Arthur's death. The overwhelming grief that had filled her days was replaced by an urgent focus. She was no longer just a widow lost in her sorrow. She was a guardian, a healer. Looking at the stranger's face, softened by the warm glow of the fire, she felt a connection that went beyond simple pity. It was a shared humanity in the face of the wild, a silent promise to fight for his life. As she adjusted the blankets around him, her hand brushed against his shoulder, and she felt a damp stickiness. Pushing aside the thick wool, she saw the source of it. The buckskin around his shoulder was dark and stiff with frozen blood. It was not an arrow wound, as she might have expected. It was the ragged, ugly tear of a bullet. Her blood ran cold. This changed everything. He was not just a victim of the storm, he had been shot. He was being hunted by white men. The danger she had invited into her home had just magnified tenfold. Now, she was not just sheltering a stranger, she was harboring a fugitive. Her hands shaking slightly, she searched his small leather pouch, hoping for some clue. Inside, she found a flint and steel, a piece of dried meat, and a small, intricately carved bone amulet in the shape of a hawk. It was a beautiful, personal object, warm from the faint heat of his body. She held it in her palm, feeling its smooth texture. This was no simple trinket. It felt like a piece of his spirit. She quickly closed the pouch, feeling like an intruder, yet the discovery deepened her resolve. The man with the hawk amulet was not just a warrior, but someone with a soul, a story, and people who cared for him. A sharp, insistent knock echoed through the cabin, making her jump. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had his pursuers found them? She grabbed Arthur's heavy rifle from its place above the mantelpiece, her hands cold and clammy. "Abigail!" A gruff voice called out, muffled by the door. "It is Finn! Open up!" Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak. She unbarred the door to find old Finn, a grizzled trapper and a friend of her late husband, his face etched with worry and dusted with snow. He stomped the snow from his boots and stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately falling on the figure by the fire. "By the saints, Abigail, what have you done?" Finn whispered, his gaze darting from the warrior to her. "Black Bart Rollins and his gang are scouring this valley. They are saying some Cheyenne savage stole a map from them." His words hit her like a physical blow. Black Bart was a name that inspired fear, a ruthless bounty hunter with a deep-seated hatred for Indians. "They are looking for him, lass," Finn said, his voice grave. "Rollins will not stop until he finds him, and he will not be kind to anyone he finds sheltering him. You must get him out of here, before they track him to your door." For 2 days, Abigail was a prisoner in her own home, the blizzard, a white curtain that separated her from the world. The warrior, her patient, drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. He tossed and turned, muttering in his own tongue, the words sharp and urgent. In his tormented sleep, one name surfaced again and again, clear and distinct. Night Hawk. She whispered the name to herself. It suited him. It spoke of keen eyes and a spirit that soared above the earth. She felt as if she was slowly getting to know the man behind the stoic warrior's facade, piece by painful piece. She tended to him tirelessly, forcing sips of warm broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. The knowledge Arthur had passed on to her was all she had. She cleaned the bullet wound as best she could, applying a poultice of Yoro to fight the infection. In those long hours, sitting by his side, she found herself talking to him, her voice low and soft. She told him about Arthur, about their dream of building a life here. She knew he likely did not understand her words, but she hoped the tone would convey her intent, that he was safe, that he was not alone. On the second night, his fever broke slightly. His eyes opened, and for the first time they were clear, focused on her face. The look was not one of a savage, but of a man assessing his situation with a sharp intelligence. His gaze held a question. "Why?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. The single English word shocked her. "My husband was a healer," she answered softly, her voice catching. "He taught me that life is precious. All life." He believed in healing, not in hatred. For a long moment he simply watched her, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. That brief exchange changed the atmosphere in the cabin completely. A fragile bridge of understanding had been built across the chasm of their two worlds. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a tentative warmth. It was more than just compassion now. It was a connection, a shared vulnerability in the heart of the storm. When she brought him more broth, their fingers brushed, and a jolt of unexpected feeling passed through her. In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of something deeper, something that made her own heart beat a little faster. Old Finn's words haunted Abigail. Black Bart Rollins was a plague on this land, a man who saw profit in death and destruction. Finn had described him as a man with eyes like a wolf, who took pleasure in cruelty. He called the natives heathens, claiming it was his God-given duty to cleanse the land of them. The story of the stolen map felt like a flimsy excuse, a justification for a hunt that was likely fueled by pure malice. The thought of such a man anywhere near her home, near Nighthawk, filled Abigail with a cold dread that was worse than the winter wind. This was a personal crusade for Rollins, she realized, and he would be relentless. "You are a good woman, Abigail, with a heart too soft for this country," Finn had said before he left, promising to keep an ear to the ground. "But your softness will get you killed. When that storm breaks, Rollins and his men will be like hounds on a scent. Leave the warrior to his fate. It is not your fight." His advice was practical, sensible. It was the voice of survival on the frontier. Any other woman would have listened. But as Abigail looked at Nighthawk, sleeping fitfully by the fire, his proud face now vulnerable, she knew she could not abandon him. It would be a betrayal of Arthur, and a betrayal of herself. Her decision was made. This cabin would no longer be a haven of solitude. It would be a fortress. She spent the next day preparing, her fear channeled into determined action. She barred the door securely and wedged thick logs against the shutters of the two small windows. She checked Arthur's heavy rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. She also found his old revolver, its weight in her hand both foreign and reassuring. She was not a fighter, but Arthur had taught her how to shoot to protect their homestead from predators. Now, the predators were human. As the day wore on, her ranch transformed. What was once a symbol of her peaceful life with Arthur was now a bulwark against the violence of the world outside. Her heart had become its own battlefield, where fear warred with a newfound, steely resolve. She glanced at Nighthawk. His presence had brought danger, but it had also awakened a part of her she thought had died with Arthur, a strength, a fierceness. She would not let Black Bart's darkness extinguish the small flame of life she was so desperately trying to protect. She would stand her ground. This was her home. On the morning of the third day, the world outside fell silent. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine, blinding white under a clear blue sky. The beauty of it was unsettling. It meant the trails were open. It meant they could be found. Abigail knew she could wait no longer. The redness and swelling around Nighthawk's wound told her that the infection was winning. The bullet had to come out. Gathering her courage, she laid out Arthur's surgical instruments on a clean linen cloth, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was a task she had only ever watched, never performed. She sterilized a scalpel and forceps in the flames of the fire, the metal glowing red-hot. Nighthawk was awake, his dark eyes watching her every move. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, stoic acceptance. He understood what she was about to do. She knelt beside him, the instruments in her trembling hands. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "Do it," he rasped, his voice firm despite the obvious pain he was in. His trust in her was a heavy weight, a responsibility that both terrified and strengthened her. The procedure was a nightmare of focused intensity. Following the memory of Arthur's skilled hands, she made a small, precise incision. A low hiss of pain escaped Nighthawk's lips, but he did not move, his jaw clenched tight. Sweat beaded on Abigail's brow as she probed the wound with the forceps. Her fingers felt clumsy, her knowledge terrifyingly inadequate. Then she felt it, the hard, unyielding shape of the lead ball. With a steady hand she did not know she possessed, she grasped it and pulled. A raw cry was torn from deep within him, and then he went limp, his body succumbing to the agony. For a moment she thought she had killed him. He was terrifyingly still, but as she frantically worked to clean and bandage the wound, she saw that his breathing, though shallow, was even. He had fainted from the shock and pain. She collapsed, back on her heels, utterly spent, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The lead bullet lay on the cloth beside her, a small, ugly piece of metal that had caused so much suffering. In that moment of shared ordeal, of pain and release, she felt an unbreakable bond form between them, forged in fire and blood. She had saved him. A fragile peace settled over the cabin, the only sounds, the crackling fire and Nighthawk's steady breathing. But it was not destined to last. A new sound broke the afternoon stillness, the rhythmic crunch of many hooves on snow. Her blood ran cold. It was too soon. She rushed to the window, scraping a patch of frost from the pane. A group of riders was emerging from the tree line, their forms dark and imposing against the white landscape. They were Cheyenne, their attire unmistakable. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, fanning out as they approached her cabin. They had come for their own. At their head rode a warrior whose face seemed carved from granite. His expression was grim, his eyes cold and piercing as they fixed on her small cabin. A wave of pure terror washed over Abigail. How would this look to them? A white woman, an outsider with one of their own wounded inside her home. They would assume the worst. She saw the rifles held ready in their arms. The leader raised a hand, and the party halted, their horses stamping restlessly, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats, a palpable wave of suspicion and anger. This was the warrior from the vision. Stoneface was his name. She knew it without knowing how. He was Nighthawk's brother. She had to act, and act quickly. Taking a deep breath to steady her hammering heart, she unbarred the door and stepped outside. She raised her hands, palms open, to show she was unarmed. Her other hand clutched the small, misshapen bullet she had removed. "I am not your enemy," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I helped him. He was dying." She held out her hand, offering the piece of lead as the only proof she had. Stoneface dismounted with a fluid grace. He walked slowly toward her, his moccasins making almost no sound on the snow. He stopped a few feet away, his presence overwhelming. His eyes flickered from her face to the bullet in her palm, then to the closed door of the cabin. He did not speak, but his gaze was a question, a demand. Without a word, he brushed past her and entered the cabin. Abigail's heart stopped. She could only pray that Nighthawk was conscious, that he could speak for her, that the fragile life she had fought so hard to save would now, in turn, save hers. Inside, Stoneface stood over his brother. Nighthawk's eyes fluttered open, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He tried to push himself up, but his brother gently motioned for him to stay down. A low, guttural exchange followed, the Cheyenne words incomprehensible to Abigail, who stood frozen in the doorway. Nighthawk's voice was weak, but he spoke with purpose, his gaze shifting to Abigail as he did. He was telling his story. He was explaining what she had done. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Her fate rested on the words of the man she had saved. After a long moment, Nighthawk finished speaking. He pointed a finger at Abigail and said something to his brother, a phrase that sounded soft, almost reverent. "Woman with the healing heart." Stoneface turned his gaze on Abigail. The cold fury in his eyes had not vanished, but it was now mingled with a grudging confusion. He looked at the clean bandage on his brother's shoulder, at the surgical tools neatly laid out, and then at the bloody bullet still clutched in her hand. He recognized the truth in what he saw, a truth that defied all his expectations of her people. Suddenly, a sharp cry from one of the warriors outside shattered the tense quiet. A warning. Stoneface moved to the doorway, his hand instantly going to the knife at his belt. Abigail rushed to the window. A new group of riders was approaching from the opposite side of the clearing. 4 of them. White men, dressed in rough furs and carrying long rifles. At their lead was a burly man with a cruel sneer. Black Bart Rollins. "Well, well," Bart's voice boomed across the snow, dripping with malice. "Looks like the heathens found themselves a little nursemaid." The arrival of the common enemy instantly changed the dynamic. The suspicion between Abigail and the Cheyenne warriors evaporated, replaced by a shared immediate threat. Stoneface's eyes met Abigail's, and in that moment, a silent alliance was formed. He barked a series of sharp commands to his men, who melted into the trees, becoming silent, deadly shadows. The hunters had become the hunted. Black Bart and his men, focused on the cabin, were riding straight into a trap. The quiet valley was about to erupt in violence. Stoneface was a skilled tactician. He knew a direct confrontation in the open would be foolish. He looked around the clearing, his eyes assessing every tree, every rock. Abigail saw his dilemma. She knew this land like the back of her hand. "There is a narrow ravine," she said, her voice low and urgent, pointing to the west. "Behind that ridge. They will be forced into a single file. It is a perfect place for an ambush." Stoneface looked at her, surprised by her strategic thinking. He studied the terrain she indicated, then gave a curt, decisive nod. The plan was set. The warriors moved with astonishing speed and silence, repositioning themselves around the ravine. As they disappeared into the trees, Old Finn suddenly emerged from the woods near the cabin. "I saw them coming," he panted, a look of grim determination on his face. "I could not leave you to face them alone." He took up a position near one of the windows, his own rifle ready. Abigail felt a surge of gratitude. She was not alone. She took her place at the other window, Arthur's rifle feeling heavy and solid in her hands, her earlier fear replaced by a cold, focused resolve. Black Bart and his men rode casually into the ravine, their laughter echoing in the still air. They were confident, arrogant, completely unaware of the fate that awaited them. When they were deep inside the narrow passage, Stoneface gave a piercing cry, a signal that was answered by a volley of arrows and rifle fire from the hidden warriors. The ambush was devastatingly effective. Cries of pain and surprise replaced the laughter. One of Bart's men fell from his horse, an arrow in his chest. Another clutched his arm, his revolver spinning away into the snow. The battle was swift and brutal. From her window, Abigail saw one of the bounty hunters trying to scramble up the rocky side of the ravine. She took a steadying breath, aimed, and fired. The man cried out and tumbled back down. She felt no triumph, only a grim sense of necessity. This was her home she was defending. Black Bart, enraged and cornered, tried to fight his way out, but he was no match for the furious charge of Stoneface, who met him in the center of the ravine. The clash of the two leaders was the final, decisive act of the battle. An eerie silence fell over the snow-covered ravine, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The battle was over. Black Bart and his gang were defeated, their reign of terror ended. The Cheyenne warriors emerged from their cover, their faces grim but victorious. They had defended their own and eliminated a long-standing threat. There was a stark finality to the scene, a brutal piece of frontier justice delivered in the cold Montana snow. Abigail lowered her rifle, her body trembling from the adrenaline. It was done. The warriors prepared to leave, making a travois to carry Nighthawk. Before they departed, Nighthawk, supported by his brother, walked slowly towards Abigail. He looked stronger, his eyes clear and full of an emotion that made her heart ache. He took her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. He pressed something into her palm. It was the carved bone hawk, his amulet. "To protect the healing heart," he said softly, his voice full of meaning. His gaze held hers for a long moment, a silent conversation of gratitude, respect, and a hint of what might have been. Stoneface stood before her next. The hard lines of his face had softened. He looked at her not as an outsider, but as an equal, a warrior in her own right. He did not offer words of thanks. He did not need to. He placed his fist over his heart and gave her a slow, profound nod. It was a gesture of ultimate respect from one of the proudest men she had ever seen. With that, he turned and led his warriors away, melting back into the vast wilderness from which they had come, leaving Abigail and old Finn standing in the silent, blood-stained snow. Abigail stood before her small cabin, the hawk amulet clutched in her hand. The world was quiet again, but it was a different silence now. It was not the sound of loneliness, but of peace, of aftermath. She had faced death, prejudice, and her own deepest fears, and she had emerged stronger. Her solitude in the crazy mountains would never feel the same. She was no longer just a widow hiding from the world. She was a woman who had forged an alliance, defended her home, and found a connection that transcended all boundaries. She would remain a guardian of this land, her heart forever marked by the warrior who had taught her that courage, like love, could bloom in the harshest of winters.